So I guess we can begin now. It seems to be that we are 1 minute after 3. So welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Sergiusz Bober. I'm a senior researcher at the European Center for Minority Issues here in Flensburg. I'm speaking from Flensburg, Danish-German borderland. And welcome to today's online talk, ECMI online talk, titled Minority Languages and Media Landscapes in Africa, Europe, and Latin America between Global and Regional Dynamics. So as the title suggests, we have a vast territory to cover today. We go fully global, although of course ECMI is very much rooted in the European context concerning minority rights and minority languages. But through today's talk, we would like to look at the linguistic diversity really from the global perspective. So we will cover African, European, and Latin American context, because we believe that of course this diversity is so vast, and so much contextualized in terms of history, political dynamics, social dynamics, and so on, that in a sense it is hard to sort of leave for a moment this very detailed picture of particular context and issues pertaining to each of the minority language spheres. But at the same time, we also believe that languages, linguistic diversity, linguistic spheres are very much coping with several common challenges, no matter where they are located in terms of geography. And these are, of course, questions related to status, educational frameworks, vitality, and digitalization, so technological change. And in today's talk, we would like to, in particular, focus our attention on the final issue, and we will try to approach it through subtopics, questions related to media. So we will try to look at this vast landscape of minority language issues through the prism of minority language media and wider issues concerning technology, digitalization, and media field. In order to try to realistically attempt a precise answer or any answer concerning such a vast geographic area, we need to turn for help to experts. And we are lucky today because we have 3 very distinguished speakers from the field of minority languages who will help us in this global journey concerning the intersection of minority languages, media, and wider technological developments. So today with us, we have 3 speakers. First of them is Professor Abiodun Salabu. Abiodun is a professor of journalism, communication, and media studies, and director of the research entity Indigenous Language Media in Africa at the Northwest University in South Africa. Importantly, besides his vast academic experience and impressive publishing output concerning minority language media in African context, Abiodun has also a practical experience in journalism. So thanks to this, he can share many insights from different angles concerning minority language media. The second speaker who is with us today is Claudia Soria. Claudia is a linguist with a PhD from the University of Pisa in Italy, and she's currently working as a researcher at the Institute for Computational Linguistics of the National Research Council, an Italian research entity. Claudia's strengths in terms of academic outputs and academic focus are the connections between linguistic diversity, linguistic vitality, and the way those are affected by technology. Last but not least, Enrique Uribe Youngblood, professor researcher at the School of Social Communication and Journalism at the Universidad Externado de Colombia. Enrique is an expert in the field of minority language media, approached both comparatively but also in the context in different Latin American contexts. And in that sense, Enrique also strongly focuses on indigenous languages and the way and the context of those languages and their links with technology. Before we begin our conversations, I would like to highlight a few points. So this talk is a part of a enhanced ECMI's focus on minority languages and minority language media. This is a research initiative which I'm coordinating with a colleague of mine, Craig Willis, and until recently, we've been mostly approaching this topic through the prism of the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on minority language media in different linguistic spheres in Europe, and the wider issue of digitalization, which of course is linked to the topic of our today's conversation. The second thing is the second thing are the connections between the today's talk and the conference, the upcoming conference, multi-platform and connecting communities, contemporary challenges for minority language media. This is the second international conference on minority language media, which our center ECMI is co-organizing with several partners. This conference will take place in Flensburg on the 31st of March and the 1st of April 2022. And this is an important networking activity for the research cluster through which our ECMI's MLM-related activities, goals are pursued. In this context, it's also important to mention that today's talk is organized in cooperation with the International Association for Minority Language Media Research, of which both Abiodun and Enrique are founding members. And before we really try to address this global issues concerning linguistic diversity and the way it is linked to different kinds of technology and media, I have to tell you about a couple of basic rules concerning the way we are going to proceed today. So first of all, this is a recorded event. And in that sense, it's important to highlight it because, you know, this will be made relatively soon after we finish. This will be made available on the ECMI's website, and then we will inform about it through different social media channels available to ECMI. So you can always return to the part of it that was particularly interesting to you, but also, of course, you can use it as basically a scientific source. You can use quotes from the conversations and so on. So this will be made available soon. In terms of questions, we want to have the Q&A session at the end of our conversation. We would kindly ask you to ask questions through the Q&A option in Zoom, so not in chat, but through Q&A, and we will return to them at the end, which means that you can ask questions throughout the event. It's also important that if you notice that certain questions are relatively similar, that the thing you wanted to ask about is actually already addressed by someone else, please use the ranking mechanism in order to have those questions, moving up on the list. And I think that this is all in terms of technical aspects and the background of the talk. It's almost 3:10. So I think that's a high time to begin to answer to the challenge. And I think that in order to begin, we need to provide the listeners with a bit of an information concerning the linguistic situations, linguistic spheres you will be addressing throughout the talk, because of course we will discuss Africa, Latin America, and Europe. But you, the invited experts, approach all those issues through particular linguistic spheres, particular languages, and so on. So in that sense, with the first question, I think it would be very good to provide the listeners with some contextual information concerning such issues as, for example, the countries you're focusing on, the regions, the languages, of course, the number of speakers, and so on. Perhaps important historical issues, whether the given language is codified or not. So we begin with this overview in order to afterwards focus in a more detailed way on the theoretical aspect that were introduced at the beginning of this talk. And in terms of the order of speakers, we approach it in the continental way, so alphabetically in the continental way. So first will be Africa, then Europe, and then Latin America. And as I said, this is just an alphabetical order, not any kind of prominence awarded to a particular region. So Abidun, the first question, the first thematic line that we would like to address is, as I said, the linguistic context that you are mostly addressing in your research. So the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Sagris, and thanks also to the other speakers and the attendees, who are here. Yeah, Africa is Africa's history of colonialism. So it was a colonized territory, a colonized continent, and that, in a way, has affected, or rather, has impacted on the linguistic configuration of the continent. Where the British colonized, you have English, very dominant there. Where the French colonized, you have a French language, as dominant there. Where the Portuguese colonized, you have a Portuguese, as dominant there. So those are referred to as the Lusophone Africa, yeah, and like that. So that, will begin to give us some kind of idea of the nature of a linguistic landscape, on the continent. English exists side by side, with the local languages, but the truth of the matter is that it has remained, the dominant language, on the continent, or rather in many parts of the continent. Yeah, it is the in many countries of Africa, English is the official language. For instance, in Nigeria, it is the official language. Yeah, there are also languages that are called national languages. Okay, those are the local languages that are major. Okay, like in Nigeria, talk of Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, and all that. Those are the national languages and all that. But then, beyond those three major languages, you have other languages that may not be categorized as major. Okay, yeah, you have the Edo, the Efik, the Bibio, the Kanuri, and all that, Ijo, And beyond these ones that I even mentioned, there are even those that are actually smaller than those ones. For instance, in Nigeria, you can talk about 400 languages. Yeah, many of them, quite small. Many of them of medium size. Besides the three major ones of Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba. That is the picture. And in South Africa, it's the same thing. Though the linguistic diversity in South Africa cannot compare to that of Nigeria. But then, there are also many languages, in South Africa. English, is also dominant, in South Africa. And then, there are other languages, like Afrikaans. Yeah, there is Zulu, okay, which is the biggest African language, in the country, yeah, and followed by Sikosa, yeah, Setswana, Sesotho, Sepedi, and all that. Yeah, so that's the picture. And for South Africa has 11 official languages, English included, Afrikaans, included, and 9 other indigenous languages, of the country. Yeah, so which means that these languages can be used, in the parliament, can be used, in courts, it can be used, even at the in higher education. Yeah, so but then the languages are not at the same level of development. Yeah, so for instance, Afrikaans is much more developed, than the indigenous African languages, in the country. Yeah, it is very well used, in higher education, very well, present, in the media, either in the print, yeah, or even on the digital platform and all that, compared to many of the indigenous languages, in South Africa. That's the picture. But then, when you look at a country like Ethiopia, yeah, because of the fact that Ethiopia was not actually colonized, it did not experience, it did not go through the experience of colonialism like many African countries, did. Amharic, is very strong. In fact, it's the strongest language, in that country, and it's a local language. It's an African language. It's a language, of commerce. It's the language of government. It's the language of parliament, and it is used, to a reasonable extent, even in the higher education. Yeah, so that's the picture. It's the dominant language in the media. That's the fact. Yeah. Most newspapers, in Ethiopia are published in Amharic. Yeah, so and that is quite different from what exists in many parts of Africa. Okay. If you also look at East Africa, Swahili, is also strong in East Africa. For instance, in Tanzania, Swahili, it's an official language. Yeah, in Tanzania, and in a way, it is also strong, in the media, even though it's not as strong as you would expect compared to English. Yeah, but that's also the picture around there. And then we may also have to consider the language policy of the colonialists, in different parts of Africa. For instance, France adopted a policy called assimilation, and for that reason, assimilation, to me, attempted to kill African languages, in so much so that the most common language, in the French colonies, and in Francophone Africa today, is French. You find French, on the tongue of almost everyone, because of the policy of assimilation that France adopted. So in a way, it has some kind of impact, some kind of implication on the linguistic situation, in Francophone countries in Africa. I guess those are probably a few things one can say for now, in general, about the linguistic picture of Africa.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Abidun, for this overview of the very complex but also vast from the point of view of the linguistic diversity situation in Africa. And now we continue our travel and we move to Europe, or the context you are most familiar with, Claudia. So this might be, of course, this linguistic situation in Italy and so on, but basically the highlights that are most important from the point of view of your research.
So thank you very much for having me here today. And linguistic diversity in Europe can be considered as a distinctive feature of the continent. And although it is difficult to count the number of languages, because counting them is always very, very ambiguous, especially since the boundaries between what counts as a language, what is counted as a dialect or patois is always very complicated. But as a continent, it is estimated that Europe hosts around 123 languages. And of course, this must be distinguished, must be separated of what counts as European Union. And the European Union, we have 24 official languages, plus around 60 regional and minority languages. To those languages, one should add also immigrant languages, sign languages, which are not always taken into account by those countings. So many of these regional and minority languages are also autochthonous languages of Europe and still survive after the nation states took over and enforced one country, one language rule. And that's why the linguistic diversity of Europe, of course, it's quite straightforward if one looks at these 24 official languages of the European Union, but still is hiding quite a lot of the real situation that is under the surface. So there is the situation, the linguistic landscape of Europe is very much stratified and diversified. So what we can say is that on top, there is all these national languages, which are as well the official languages of the Union. There is English that is widespread everywhere. And I think that nowadays Europe can truly be considered as a multilingual society, not only linguistically diverse society, but also multilingual society in the sense that different languages actually form part of the linguistic repertoire of people, of citizens. So we have English, for instance, at least in Italy, we have this policy in education so that pupils should learn. It's called English +2 approach. So pupils should learn English plus 2 more European languages. And English is widespread among young people. And but still, this hides a little bit the what is the heritage, what is the true heritage of Europe in terms of its minority and the regional languages, which are those actually suffering the most from the modern multilingualism, current multilingualism. So on the one hand, linguistic diversity is considered an asset of Europe, but it was not always the case. And this is quite a recent shift in the attitude, also at a political and a political level. Until recently, the linguistic diversity of Europe was rather presented as a problem, as an obstacle to achieve unity, as an obstacle to be overcome in order to allow for swift, easy, and fluid communication among citizens of the Union. And so also the narration that was made was that of the efforts that the European Union was doing in order to improve ways to help citizens interact in another language and facilitate communication, but as a means of solving a problem rather than, valorizing an asset. So there is a little bit of what I would define as a linguistic neurosis in Europe. So, and principles and other things that I think it's important to stress is that on the one hand, there is the theory and the principles, which are often announced in also documents, communication, treaties, whatever at the European Union level. And the other one is the practice, is reality. So there is a wide gap between the two. So on the one hand, linguistic diversity is truly appreciated and enforced as one of the things that should be valorized. On the other hand, this is not always the case, and multilingualism in Europe is often neglected and unrecognized. So there is still what I think are the biggest cultural stumbling blocks still lie at the national levels. For instance, my context, the Italian context, which of course I'm most familiar with, in Italy, I think that Italy is generally perceived as a monolingual country with Southern Italian spoken, and probably some people will know that around the borders of Italy, there is also German spoken, French, and Slovene. And this is, of course, true, but the truth is that Italy is home to 40 different languages. And of those 40 different languages, only 12 are recognized by the state. And saying that they are recognized by the states always is saying almost nothing, because there is this formal recognition, but no real policy enforcing their use, enforcing education, enforcing their promotion and sustainment.
Yeah, I think that, well, we will also try to address the issues concerning policies in the following subtopic. But thanks a lot for this initial overview, Claudia. an interesting statement concerning the linguistic neurosis concerning Europe. I think this is definitely some kind of a catchphrase to take from this talk, and maybe we will return to this in the Q&A. And Enrique, how the situation looks in the context you are the most familiar with.
Well, thank you, Sergej, and the ECMI for the invitation first that I have mentioned. To tell you about in the Americas in general, we have a similar situation to what Abiodun had mentioned of Africa because of the colonial past. So you have mostly European languages being the main or official language. It's not always official, but it's the main language spoken in most of the countries in the Americas. And you get the indigenous or pre-colonial languages to have usually minority populations speaking it. There are some differences in between the countries, taking, for instance, Paraguay as an example in which the indigenous language is the one most spoken in Paraguay. But apart from the Guarani in Paraguay, still it's Spanish, which is the most used language in official matters in the country. So the situation is mostly languages that are small in relation to the population. Some languages which cross over borders, such as Quechua, which comes from all the way south of Colombia down, even touching the northern part of Argentina. So it's spread, it's a macro language, so there's a lot of variety between different forms of the Quechua language. But most of the languages are smaller in relation to the largest population. And if we think that one of the largest languages in that sense would be Guarani or even Quechua with around 7 to 8 million speakers, it's really a fraction of the probably billion people in population of the whole Americas. So you realize that they're smaller in number in most of the cases. I mean, there are some exceptions, but in general, they have small numbers of speakers. Some examples of transnational indigenous languages. We also have Creole languages that are official in some of the countries, particularly in the islands. But in that general situation, the majority languages which are really big are English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, same as was mentioned for the case of Africa. And regarding now other levels of recognition or something like that, there's a wide variety of how they're recognized in different countries in the Americas in general. But just to take that, we don't, apart from the case of Guarani in Paraguay, which I think might be interesting because of what Abiodun also mentioned of Amharic in Ethiopia, still, even the one that has the largest population in relation to the national population is not as used in official or high prestige areas as the case of Spanish. So it remains that Spanish, Portuguese for South America, Spanish for Central and part of North America, and then English and French for North America are the majority languages, which are considerably larger in number of users.
Yes, thank you, Enrique, for this initial overview. And I think that with this, let's say, basic knowledge concerning the linguistic landscape in each of the continents that we try to cover today, we can already, of course, see the variety of cases, situations, the ways languages are used. I would like to return to the issue that was up to a certain degree already touched upon by you. So basically, the instruments, the policies that are being implemented or absent, even, of course, this is also a possibility in different countries. And again, the context you are most familiar with. So the question would be how the sort of infrastructure looks in terms of linguistic diversity. And as I of course mentioned this before, that was up to a certain point addressed, but perhaps we can try to be slightly more detailed. So, what are the policies protecting linguistic diversity, individual languages, whether are there policies taking into account the need for protecting particular languages, making them basically survive, because we know that in several cases the number of speakers is getting very limited. So what's this infrastructure in terms of legal aspects like policies, but also financial support, and then maybe even organizational infrastructure, because of course this can be linked to educational tools and so on. So maybe we can again begin with Abiodun. And for example, in the South African context, we have several languages that are considered official languages. And then the natural question would be, you already hinted at different ways English is used and Afrikaans is used, but how are those languages supported in order to be as equal as possible in the wider area of the daily use of languages?
Okay, thank you, Segwit. Act 108 of South African Constitution recognizes, the diminished status of African languages, the historically marginalized languages in Africa, in South Africa, and government, has been making, efforts to develop these languages, in different ways and manners. That is the truth of the matter. I do know that South African government, encourages multilingualism, in education. So much that it will not just be, only English, that is being used, for teaching. In our university here at the Northwest University, that's also, the language policy of our university, multilingualism. But as I said, these languages, there are different stages of development. So while you have English and Afrikaans, being well used, in our university, for instance, for instructional purposes, you do not have much of that, for Setswana or Sesotho. But the policy is not against that. It's just that maybe these languages, have not been developed, to that level, to be able to be used for scientific purposes. Of course, people talk about intellectualization of African languages, so that African languages can be developed, to be used, in certain domains, like in science, in engineering, mathematics, and all that. But I believe that efforts are on. We are not yet there. But efforts are on, to make sure that that is done. I also know that University of KwaZulu-Natal, in South Africa, also tries to promote the use of isiZulu, in the university. It's a compulsory module for every first year students, to take isiZulu, in the university. And I know that even at Rhodes University, they also try to teach isiXhosa to journalism students, to pharmacy students, and to some other students, so that they can, so that they are able to use isiXhosa for their professional operations and all that. And even in South Africa, there's also what is called a MDDA, that's a Media Diversity and Development Agency. And the purpose of that agency, is to be able to promote, access to information and communication, in different languages of South Africa, and, particularly the historically diminished languages or historically diminished cultural groups. And MDDA has been trying to support community media, community radio stations, and all that. It's doing well, in the area of community radio, but I cannot really say much, in terms of community newspapers. Because you discover that the so-called community newspapers, some of them still publish in English language, or probably they use bilingual language, English, with local language. That is the picture, in South Africa. Nigeria also attempts, to manage the diversity of languages, through certain instruments. Constitution, is also one important instrument that Nigeria uses, to do that. Nigeria encourages, the use of local languages, in the regional assemblies. They want, apart from English, there's that encouragement that, regional assemblies, that can, particularly where they are linguistically unified, where there's mono linguistic situation. But then the problem is the implementation. Because you still discover that these so-called regional assemblies, legislators, still debate, still talk, in English language, rather than using the local language. Whether they are speaking the English language the correct manner or the correct way or not, that's a different ballgame. But the fact of the matter is that instead of them, using more of the local language, for instance, in states, that linguistically monolithic, like Oyo State, for instance, we know it's Yoruba language that everybody speaks there, Ogun State, or to some extent, Osun State. We'll expect them to be speaking more of Yoruba language, in this regional assembly, but it is still more of English. And then the language policy in education also tries to address, this issue of the use of indigenous languages, in the country. The policy states, the 1977 policy revised in 1981, revised in 2004, revised in 2008. The policy says that the first 3 years of education should be in the local language, the mother tongue of the child, or the language of the immediate community. And then, from the fourth year in primary school, English, should then be used gradually as a medium of instruction. But you discover that that is not actually, what is happening, in many of these primary schools, particularly the privately owned ones. They just start this, the children, even from pre-primary school, they just start them, in English language. So much so that by the time the children become adults, they are not able to speak the local language again. And the parents also take a lot of delight, in the fact that, oh, my child, is able to speak English language. My child cannot speak, in the local language. So they take a lot of pride, in that. In fact, if they send their children to schools and their children are not able to master the English language well, that school is not good. So they are going to withdraw their children, from such schools. And I'm not too sure whether even the public schools, whether they are also helping in that regard. And again, the policy also encourages, that apart from learning your own mother tongue, Nigerians should also learn one language, one of the 3 major languages, in addition to their own mother tongue. But then the minority language speakers, have been protesting against this, that, because, that it will mean that the government is privileging the majority languages, over their own languages. So these are the kind of protestations, that also attend to some of these policies and the instruments that the government uses.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Abidun. I think already it is possible to see certain dynamics not that dissimilar to what we can identify in Europe, about which Claudia will be speaking soon. So the linguistic diversity, but its approach to the meaning of English, and the learning of other sort of national languages present in Europe, but not necessarily local languages, or local dialects and so on. But I wonder what would be your take on this, Claudia? So how the situation looks in Europe in terms of policies and so on, where perhaps we should also remember that the mechanisms on the international level are relatively complex in the region, with instruments such as the Framework Convention and Language Charter, and then monitoring mechanisms and so on. So this infrastructure is perhaps developed, but whether it's efficient, that's a question. So Claudia, please, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I was muted. As you were mentioning, we have different levels of institutional support or lack of support for languages. The equal status. Well, no. Let me start in another way. The value importance of linguistic diversity in terms of its protection is stated already in the European Treaty. Article 3, and also Article 22 of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights also says that respect shall be given to linguistic diversity. Okay, this is the general high level stance. Then there is the official recognition that is granted to the 24 official languages of the European Union. And this means that any citizen of the European Union has the right to address the European institutions in his or her official language, and has the right to be attended in the same language. This is true in theory. In practice is much different. Also, because there have been reports of, if I'm not mistaken, Irish deputies not being granted the right to speak in Irish because of the lack of Irish to English interpreters. So in practice, the lack of translators, the lack of interpreters or understaffed departments make it much more difficult to implement this complete and ideal multilingualism. These are the level of Europe and the official languages of Europe. For what concerns minority languages, there is no specific legislation. There is the European Charter of, for regional minority languages of the Council of Europe. And this is a convention for the protection and promotion of languages used by traditional minorities. And the charter has been signed by almost all the European countries, but not ratified by all of them. And for instance, Italy is one of those which has never ratified the charter. But again, there is no way, no real way for Europe to enforce any kind of protection of really effective measures for protection of linguistic diversity at the national level. And this varies very, very much from one nation to the other. There are countries in which there are several linguistic, minority languages recognized. There is, for instance, in France, where there is no one. In the case of Italy, we have some recognition, but recognition doesn't mean that they are official or co-official, or that can be used in court, or they can be used in education. So they are granted some level of protection or funding, which is of course good, especially for implementing some educational policies. But it, of course, is not enough. The existence, however, of these 24 official languages, this must be said, has given an enormous impulse to language technologies in order to support the daily work of translators and interpreters who at the European level have an enormous amount of documents to be translated. And since many years, the European Union has put a lot of funding for developing the linguistic language technologies that are effective in order to help those people in their daily work. And at the moment, we can say that there is a true technological support, at least for the official languages. For what concern, again, regional minority languages, there's been a recent, quite a recent resolution, the Language Equality in the Digital Age resolution of the European Union. And this is a resolution that actually favors and intends to provide the framework for the development of technological solutions that should, in the future, provide digital linguistic equality to all languages of Europe. But I'll be back to that later during the talk. And yeah, I think this is what I wanted to say mostly. Yeah.
Thank you so far, Claudia. And now I'm passing the mic to you, Enrique, with the hope that the situation is slightly better in South America, but I guess we shouldn't be too optimistic.
Well, yeah, Sergey, I mean, the first thing to say is in the last 30 years, there have been considerable changes, mainly, or to start with, in the constitutional level. So, for instance, in Colombia in 1991, in the 1991 Constitution recognized Colombia for the first time as a multi-ethnic and multicultural country, and thus claiming that the indigenous languages were also official, but limiting that to their territories, which has been a very complex issue, and it has been debated. Then Venezuela in 1999 went a bit further than that, claiming that indigenous languages would be recognized as official in the national territory. Obviously, implementation becomes a whole other problem, but at least they first received those kind of acknowledgements in the constitution. In the 2005 and between 2005 and 2008, in the Bolivian constitution, then Bolivia acknowledged that because they are multinational country, that they should have more official languages. And what it actually says is that all communications by any kind of regional department in the country should be made in at least 2 official languages, one of them being Spanish. So Spanish is the national official language, and then all the regions get to choose which one is their co-official language, one of the indigenous languages most spoken, most used. And they have a list of languages, which I'm not sure of the exact number, but I think it's 32 languages that are listed directly in the Constitution. And very recently, this year, in Mexico, the Senate has approved modifying Article 2 of the Constitution to mention that all 68 recognized indigenous languages are also official as part of their heritage. Now, mind you, this has been those 30 years. And there have been different stages in different countries of levels of recognition. You have Peru that has for a long while had Quechua and Aymara as part of the official languages in Peru, or in Paraguay, as I mentioned, with Guarani and Spanish. So you have a lot of recognition, at least in that first sense, let's put it that way. However, as I think we can take from our experience in Colombia as a good example, how long does it take from it to be part of the Constitution to then be part of other levels of legislation? And in the Colombian case, the language law came out in 2010. So it was 19 years after the Constitution had claimed that these languages were official in those territories. There had been no law that said how should they go forward in terms of how that is going to be integrated to education and to other policies. So as you can imagine, 19 years went by just to get that into a law. And then from that point onward, all the changes that implies, because adding the indigenous languages into school curriculum, for instance, is not only a matter of just dealing with the language, but with a lot of cultural elements and a different way of thinking about education to the way that it had been done by the state. And that has created a lot of issues in the implementation of these policies in favor of different languages. Also, another issue that takes place there is the distance between those that are considered to be indigenous languages, for the indigenous populations previous to colonization, and those that are Creole languages, which can also be the majority of speakers of the archipelago of San Andres in the Colombian case. And then these populations try to come under that same heading, even though they're not indigenous in that sense of pre-colonial existence, but they try to be covered by the same type of mechanisms that exist. In the other countries, well, this has created a certain amount of difficulties in the sense of how do you implement it. I mean, first, the constitutional level is important because it brings recognition, but then it's the difficulty of the many different languages. As I mentioned, just for the Mexican case, there are 68 now recognized in Mexico. And that would imply a lot of changes in policies and in structures and in the creation of other spaces or money that would become available. And certainly international instruments and international elements, particularly more those related to heritage, have had a big impact on cultural heritage and intangible heritage, have had a very large impact on how these things have developed in Latin America. And obviously in the contact mainly with Spain and with the Catalan in Catalonia and Basque in the Basque country, or Gallego in Galician in Galicia. That has also had a very strong impact because they've always been very heavily involved in all of these developments in Latin America. So that has also had an impact on the political developments. But it's still, as I said, first a matter of recognition that appears in the main political element in the constitution, but that it's become very complex in the sense of bringing it to other spheres. For instance, something like using the language in with the judiciary, for instance, that has become very problematic, or using it even in Congress. In some instances, it has been proven to be very difficult. But still, they're striving in that general sense, and with a certain time gap, then there's developments in the sense of a special language law and then application of that particular law.
Thank you very much, Enrique. I think we can all already see that in the three cases, broad cases discussed here, so Africa, Latin America, and Europe, some ideas are there in the air, even in the legislation, but definitely there is much room left for improvement in terms of implementation. So in that sense, our experience is, I think, similar in all the areas we come from. But now having this broad background of the linguistic situation, spheres, legal context in different areas, I would like to turn our attention to media-related issues. So basically, minority language media landscapes, if we can call them this way, and the most familiar to you, of course. So the question would be, in what kinds of minority language media outlets, initiatives, those linguistic situations result? Are there any minority language media? Are they strong? Do they have very visible readership, viewing figures? Are there bottom-up initiatives concerning this? So let's try to sort of provide a vast picture of the minority language media situations in the linguistic spheres most familiar to you. Abiodun, please go ahead.
Well, the situation with African language media is reflective of the situation with African languages themselves. Yeah, because as long as African languages are not embraced as they should, so the media that use them are also not likely to be embraced, particularly the print media. In terms of broadcast, African languages are doing well. In terms of broadcast, no doubt about it, across Africa. And probably that still tells us that Africa is still largely an orature, is a culture of oracy, so to say. So the culture of oracy is still very dominant, it's still very entrenched in Africa rather than the culture of literacy. Yeah, people still prefer to speak and hear rather than to read and write. To me, that's what it seems. Because on the radio, you find African languages doing very fantastically well. In South Africa, for instance, of the top 20 radio stations, in South Africa, at least not less than 10 of them, are radio stations that broadcast purely in African languages. But the first two most popular radio stations in South Africa today there are radio stations that broadcast, in African language, like Ukozi FM. Ukozi FM, broadcasts purely in isiZulu, and it is the most popular radio station in the country. Then, followed by Umblombo Wenene, which broadcasts in Isikosa. Okay, yeah, and even here, in the province where we are here, Mosweding FM is also not doing badly. In terms of ranking, I think it is the sixth, the sixth most popular radio station, in the country. So that tells us that African languages are not doing badly, in the broadcasting landscape. But the real problem, is still in the print, and on the digital platform. Yeah, how much African languages, do we have, in the print media and the digital platform? For instance, now where we are here in this province, there is no newspaper that is published, in any African language here. Yeah, there used to be one called the Imenga Dikang, yeah, which I learned because some of my colleagues, did a study on it. It started purely as a Setswana newspaper. Then, it's transformed to a bilingual newspaper, English and Setswana. And again, it transformed, purely to English language newspaper. It is only Setswana in the title. Yeah, so that is it. But the only daily newspaper in African language in South Africa today is Isolezwe, which is an isiZulu newspaper. Yeah, of course, the Zulu language, is the most present language in the media. If you want to talk about African languages in the media in South Africa, because they are in KwaZulu-Natal, where Zulu is spoken, which is the home of Zulu language. Apart from Isolezwe, which is a daily newspaper published Monday to Friday, yeah, you also have some other subsidiary titles of Isolezwe, okay, that are weekly, weekend newspapers and all that. And apart from that, you have a Hilanga, which is a newspaper that started in 1903, and it is still there till today. It also has subsidiaries, and all that. Africa used to be there, Africa was also a very old newspaper, but Africa is having challenge, currently. So that is the picture. Yeah, if you look at Nigeria, again, you find a similar picture there. Many newspapers, that had come, into the market, they have died. Many of them did not even survive long. There's high attrition rate, okay, for African language newspapers. But then, you still have some success stories. Okay, like in the northern part of Nigeria, there's a newspaper called the Gaskia Tafikwogo, which started in 1937, and it is still there today. In Yoruba land, hey, the newspaper that is doing well, is Alaroye newspaper, which started in 1996, and that was after a number of attempts which had failed. But since it came up again in 1996, Alaroye has remained in the market, and it has got also a number of subsidiaries like Akedia Agbaye, Alaroye Magazine, and all that. So you can talk of pockets of successes, of this newspaper. Igbo language, is a major language in Nigeria. There is no known newspaper, in that language that I know. Yeah, so that tells you, the picture of what we are saying. So yeah, so there are pockets of successes. In Uganda, you can talk of Bukede, okay, which is a strong Luganda newspaper. In Uganda, in Tanzania, you can also talk of a number of Swahili newspapers. Yeah, but they are not doing as much as the English newspapers. Yeah. But as I said, previously, Ethiopia, yeah, Amharic is strong, in the media. So you find Amharic newspapers doing very well. At this Zemen, is a government newspaper, daily newspaper published in Amharic, and it's a very strong newspaper. If not the most dominant newspaper, in that country, so at least one of the very strong ones, in that place. And again, one other thing that we also need to understand about African language newspapers is that for some of them that are even successful, what they practice is tabloidization, sensational journalism. They do not really, venture into quality journalism. So they dwell on the salacious stories, the scandals, the sensational headlines and all that. And I guess they do that because they probably know that is what the leadership wants. So they try to pamper the leadership to their taste. Yeah, and because if you look at the Alawi newspaper, it's like that. So sensational headlines, yeah, sensational stories. Bukede, in Uganda, it's like that. Yeah, so Ilanga, in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, it's like that. So you find many of these newspapers, they operate more like tabloids, than a quality newspaper. So I think these are some of the things I can say. Yeah.
Abidjan, perhaps I will pass the mic to Claudia, and in the meantime, hopefully your connection will get better, because over the last minute or so, a couple of times it was cut. So yeah, thanks, many thanks for this. And Claudia, the same question is for you now. So how the minority language media landscape looks in the context you are most familiar with in terms of the healthiness of it. And I think that in Europe, perhaps what might play a role in terms of the strength of a particular minority language media landscape might be, for example, the assistance in terms of funding and so on provided by kin states. So I wonder whether you think that this matters in terms of the strength of a particular MLM landscape, or actually other factors are more important in order to have a certain level of, let's say, richness of media content produced in a given minority language.
It certainly matters, but as a whole, at a very general level, and also, of course, simplifying a lot, I think that what we can say is that if, on the one hand, in the past, the advent of the print and printing facilities had killed or restricted immensely the space given to minority languages, because obviously only those with economic and political power could afford printing facilities and also the money to finance these media. The advent of the internet has changed the landscape completely. And since there is this possibility of user-initiated content under the forms of blogs or posts or websites, and recently the incredible forest of social media, minority languages have started to thrive again. At least at that level, in those spaces. And these media, these digital media, have provided safe spaces where minority language speakers could interact, could talk, could use again the languages that were, until very recently, maybe 10, 20 years ago, were still limited to familiar use or among relatives. So people started to interact again among strangers using those languages outside of the family, and most importantly also in written form and not only in oral form. And many, if not the majority, certainly the majority of these minority languages in Europe were, and many of them still are, unwritten languages. So orthography is not always standardized, or accessible to the speakers in a widespread way. And these media, digital media, have also provided a means and a space for enforcing, consolidating the written form, the orthography of many of those languages. In many cases, in a way that was really truly bottom up, so user generated and user driven, instead of an academy or some sort of power, overarching power dictating the way a language should be written. So media, new media, as they were usually called, were certainly beneficial to a certain extent. And to the extent, to what extent? The extent to which, in which then media are actually up to the standard of other official languages. So now we are entering a phase where there is an imbalance between the technological support that is accessible and provided to official languages and the technological support that is provided to non-official, minority, endangered, whatever languages. And this gap is widening day by day. And there is much concern in the community at the political and also research and development level as to what should be done in order to be able to close this gap. Because new media, internet, digital media go hand in hand with availability of language technologies, which are very much widespread and are very much behind almost every application and programming and interface that we interact in our daily life. I can give you a list of what is involved in any speech technology, automated translation, search engines, automatic subtitling, chatbots, voice control, voice command, gaming, social media, online data, text generation. So all these kind of applications that we usually perform and carry out using our mainstream language. So the language in which we interact in most of our time, and that generally coincides with the official language of the place we are living in. So there is an increasingly wide amount of tasks, of digital tasks that we are able to perform using those languages. And the same cannot be said of the regional or minority languages we are speakers as well of. And so if it's becoming increasingly common to be talking or to be interacting with the car, with the driving assistant in the car in a language, it's becoming also increasingly awkward to stop talking with your friend or relative in the car in your language and then shift into the official language in order to interact with the car, because the car, of course, doesn't speak your minority language, it doesn't understand your minority language. And the same for home appliances. If you imagine that you are going to talk with a fridge, or in order to know whether the supply you want to bake the cake you want to bake are there in the fridge, but you need to talk with the fridge in your official language, while in the household you are talking another language. So this is a kind of strange things that will probably increasingly happen in the future, and also represent a risk for minority languages, because they represent a block in the usage and what has been called the digital diglossia situation. So you started using one language, the official one, the most widespread dominant language, for a number of tasks, and then at least in some digital context, you are prohibited, you are forced to not to use the language you would outside the digital context because there is no technological support for it. I stop here.
Thank you, Claudia. And again, Claudia's remarks bring me straight to you, Enrique. And the question, because Claudia very nicely bridged this question concerning, minority language media landscapes, but also certain technological developments that affect this field. And in that sense, perhaps you could reflect upon those connections as well, in such a sense that I think on the one hand, we are now we have experience not only coming from this talk, but also, of course, research conducted in many linguistic spheres. But I think that the initial reaction to technology quite frequently was relatively optimistic in terms of the support it can provide for linguistic diversity and lesser spoken languages and so on. But then at some point the thing called globalization kicked in with the predominance of English or national languages and niches similar to what Claudia mentioned, interfaces operating just in big languages and so on. There are, of course, language activists who try to have them in minority languages, but then the means are limited, commercial potential is limited. So with these thoughts, perhaps let's try to see how the situation looks in South America.
Well, so yeah, for South America and in general, I think for most of Latin America, it would be the case similar to what Abiodun was mentioning for Africa. And it's most of the indigenous language media or the minority language media would be small narrowcast radio stations. And in most cases, even most indigenous radio stations are likely not exclusively in the minority language, but rather between the majority language and the minority language. So there are some cases of radio stations that would be solely in one of the languages, but it's more often the case that they would use more than one language, depending on the audience that they're trying to reach. And that's because even though the indigenous population is very large in most Latin American countries, only a percentage of that population speaks the minority language, speaks their own traditional language. Another issue that is more favorable, as Abiodun was mentioning, was the fact that most of these languages have no written form, or the written form came afterwards, and it was done mainly by linguists in compiling dictionaries and things like that. So it creates different orthographies that make it complex for the people to learn how to write in their languages. Another issue that has to deal with that as well is the geographical areas where most of these indigenous people live tend to be predominantly near mountains or in the jungle or in broken terrain, where radio is more efficient to reach an audience than other means. So those are some of the reasons why radio is the main, let's say, standard medium that they use. Some of them have done other things. Indigenous groups are known for doing video and spreading it through different ways. So rather than for broadcast, but doing it through other means of sharing their video production. And more recently, obviously using YouTube channels and things like that as a way of distributing their content, mainly also to other indigenous groups. But they still experience the same difficulty, that is they have to use a majority language or an adult version or subtitles in order to reach other indigenous audiences, because their common language audiences are very small. Few of them have spaces in, let's say, public or private television channels, and you will see smatterings of indigenous language production in mainly public channels. In the case of the radio stations, most of the radio stations are what are known as community radio stations or public interest radio stations that have some financing that comes either directly from the state or through the indigenous organizations, and that's how they keep them up. In reaching other areas, well, digitalization is very uneven, and it's extremely so in the case of indigenous communities. So there's very little content in comparison to other things. And when they have indigenous communities have content, mostly it's in the majority language. even though they would have things in the minority language, that here again comes with the construction of websites as we've understood them tends to be a very, let's say, a very written concept. It's based on writing, and by being based on writing, it's very difficult for them to engage in that construction of websites. And there are more traditional ways of communication which are different, and it's how they would consider themselves as providing their own media, are events in gatherings and in which they have their own social ways of expression and the use of music, and that's how they consider traditional. In many of the indigenous groups, they've created their own communication structure, in which they oftentimes talk about their own media, which refers to these kind of traditional forms of communication, and appropriated media. And in that, they refer to how they've taken Western European media and incorporated it. They have the same issue that I guess happens in Africa and in Europe, of the difference between the quality of their content in this idea of what quality represents. And obviously, they tend to compare themselves to national media outlets in all these places. And then that's what considered to be the comparison to determine whether they're good quality journalism, for instance. Whereas they tend to be really good at covering and dealing with local important issues to them, and generating networks with other indigenous groups and organizations, which is another thing they do. But then again, in this case, that would require them to go through the majority language or through any of the other major languages to provide this exchange. So that's mainly the situation. There's, as I said, smatterings in other media forms. There are some things that you can find online, and on YouTube you would find videos and songs and everything done in the minority languages, and the use of well, social networking sites, and particularly instant messaging over the mobile phones, particularly because in many other countries they're allowed to use that with no limit of data. Then, because of their oral dedication, they tend to use voice messages rather than texting to the systems. But that has become a way that also this indigenous media outlets get information and share bits in their own language. And it's using it through the possibilities that are allowed using WhatsApp or other instant messaging services. And that has become very relevant for them as a way of bringing the language around. And it's only in the most recent generations that we see an increase in their alphabetization in their own language. But still, it's not a large percentage of their populations.
Thank you very much, Enrique, for this complex overview of the situation in South American linguistic context. When I look at the clock, and I'm really worried because this fascinating talk is unfortunately coming to an end. But before concluding our conversation, of course, we need to return to the issue mentioned at the very beginning. So the question and answers part of it. There is a couple of questions in the Q&A. Of course, when the panelists will be answering those that are already there, you can still contribute. I'm speaking to the audience now. You can still contribute with the question of your own if there's any particular issue, linguistic group of interest for you. But we have a question from Ellen Jones to all the panelists. And the question goes like this: what are the panel's views on the differences between indigenous and minority languages in the context of media? So to what degree, those two categories result in different media landscapes due to different contextual issues? Does anyone volunteers to answer this? Please go ahead, Enrique.
Right. Well, that is a very, very important question in the Latin American case, I think, in general, because as I mentioned, indigenous is usually associated with those languages that were previous to colonization, and that does not include then migrations that came after the colonizing efforts, and that excludes then other minority languages which could be Rom, for instance, minority languages which are Creole languages in the islands of the Caribbean. It doesn't include any other migrations that came afterwards. I mean, there's large enough communities in those countries, also of migrants of different countries, more recent migrants. For instance, in the case of the minority language, as has been discussed in the United States, with Spanish as a large minority language in the United States, and it has a massive media infrastructure in that sense. So yeah, it generates different spaces or fields and how it's a language considered to be indigenous, and also because indigenous communities have also moved between the borders of the nation states. We know, so whatever might be accepted as a national indigenous minority in one country, once you cross over the border, where they still have presence, but they've crossed over the border over the years, in the other country, they're not recognized as a national indigenous minority. They're considered to be a minority of another country, regardless of the fact that they have been moving across this border for a long time. So they're not necessarily the same, and they don't work the same way, but all indigenous languages, I would say, all of those indigenous communities are minorities within the nation states in which they abide. Even in the cases I mentioned, in the case of Paraguay, where the indigenous language, Guarani, is in a minority position in relation to Spanish, despite being official, despite being used in education, it's still not as used in the media, not as used in higher education and in official businesses. So they have their common elements, but they're not necessarily the same.
Abiodun, would you like to contribute on this?
Well, it depends on the context. In Africa, in relation to the colonial languages, for instance, like English and French, we will say that languages that developed in Africa, that originated from Africa, are indigenous. That is in relation to foreign languages like French, English, and other. They are indigenous. They are Afrikaans, for instance, also may not be regarded as indigenous African language. It is an African language, but there is a whole lot of debate that it is not indigenous to Africa. Yeah. So that is the context. But when you look at African languages, in general, in relation to the global languages, English, French, at the global level, not within African states, you will regard African languages to be minority languages, because their use, their use is not as widespread as English. Okay, that is all over the globe. We are here now speaking English. We all cannot speak my language, which is Yoruba. Okay, so in that respect, we say, okay, African languages are minority languages because they are limited in use compared to the global languages of English, French, and others. But then, even within African countries, certain indigenous languages are regarded as majority languages, and certain of those languages are regarded as minority languages, depending on the number of speakers. Yeah, to use the example of Nigeria, which I gave, three languages are regarded as majority languages or major languages. Okay, Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, because they are spoken by a large number of people. Yeah, compared to other languages that are spoken by lesser number of people. So those ones are regarded as minority, within the context of that country. So it depends on the context.
Thanks, Abidun. Claudia, would you like to contribute to this?
Oh, well, it depends if there are more other pressing questions that you want to be answered first.
Yeah, okay. So perhaps I can take one more from the floor, okay, and then we can return to. There is a question from Israel Fadipe, and this concern, I guess, Abidun, you are the addressee of this.
Yeah.
Because of your expertise. So does African Union have official languages that are of African origin, considering that European Union has 24 official languages and those being of European origin? So does this two institutional realities compare?
Yeah, I think I answered that question, in the chat box, but no problem. I can still talk about it. I said no. Yeah, I know that because the official languages, of African Union are English, French, Arabic. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, those are the three that I'm certain about: English, French, Arabic. I know that at some point, there was an attempt to promote Swahili, to an official language of African Union. Yeah, but I don't think that has materialized. Yeah, but the question will also be, going by the question that this colleague posed: is Swahili, a language that originated, from Africa? So there's also, a lot of debate about that Swahili is not indigenous to Africa. Swahili, is a combination of Arabic language and some local languages, languages, in East Africa. So there may also be, some kind of debate around that. But the fact still remains that it is widely spoken in East Africa.
Yeah. Thanks for this, Abidun. And Claudia, I promised an opportunity to speak to you, but perhaps, if you don't mind, we can tell, and this would be the concluding question of the panel, because time is really flying so fast. Because of your experience in the work concerning, the interconnections between languages and technology, and then links of those to revitalization, I just wonder, from the Italian example, is there any particular linguistic sphere which you could highlight as being the role model, a good practice example in terms of using of digital technologies in order to further the revitalization and strengthening of a particular lesser spoken language?
From Italy, unfortunately, not, because still the minority languages spoken in Italy, regional, which they are still lagging behind in terms of participation to the digital movement and presence on digital media and applications. From a European perspective, on the other hand, there are several good examples. And well, I could mention many. Probably the most striking one could be the Sami language in Norway. And because of the incredible organization between, or probably also thanks to the fact that it's quite a small community, and there is a strong personal relationship also between developers, researchers, and the speakers of the languages. But they have gone so far so as to be able to develop robots talking in Sami, and paving the way to assistive technology, assistive robots also for elderly people. And from that point of view, we can imagine that the incredible and fantastic landscape of applications of technology in this respect. So for assisting elderly people who are probably more keen to be talking and to still interacting in their heritage language, and with the technology giving them the possibility to do so. And of course, the Catalan example, the example of Basque, and Frisian also, they are very in the Netherlands are doing wonders in this respect. And yeah, so these are just those who come to the tip of my tongue.
Yeah. Thank you for this. It's actually past, so we need to finish. But I think that, well, we've seen over this past 90 minutes that the intuition, I think, behind this talk was correct in such a sense that indeed a lot of the challenges are shared across the board, no matter whether it's Europe, Latin America, or Africa, in terms of, smaller languages, minority languages, and then the way they face challenges concerning revitalization, media, and so on. Definitely, there's a lot of work to be done on the side of the authorities, but maybe also activists who should be provided with better means in order to work towards the preservation of different languages. But I'm happy to finish with this positive content provided by Claudia. Of course, the number perhaps of those good practices and good examples is limited. Not everywhere financial means are available up to the degree comparable with those enjoyed by Sami speaking community in the far north of Europe. But at least it gives some kind of hope that there are ways also related to highly advanced technology that can work towards the goal that I think we share all gathered here today, which is the preservation of this unique heritage that we have on a global scale, that is linguistic diversity and the possibility of expressing oneself in the language closest to one's heart, if I can put it this way. So thank you so much for today. It was a very interesting talk, and I think a lot of food for thought, and perhaps even the beginning of a longer cycle of conversations concerning similar issues. I would also like to say that the recording, which I mentioned at the beginning, will be available soon, and then spread through different channels. So you will be able to return to this, listen to the fragments you particularly enjoyed or you want to use in your own research. And then please also try to follow different social media channels of ECMI, because thanks to this, you can stay up to date with our different initiatives from the field of minority languages and minority language media. And I can promise that you will hear more from us. So thank you so much for today again, and I hope to see you in different contexts soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for the invitation, ECMI.
Thank you.